All right, we will get started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join us. We're excited to get started. My name is Joey, and I'm a project manager here at Rebuild by Design. Rebuild by Design's origin is really in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy's regional design competitions, and we convene local, regional, and national experts to solve emerging challenges primarily around climate adaptation. So today we're holding our second speaker panel. It's called Flood Insurance and Housing of our Building Resilience in Rural Community Speaker Series. And Rebuild by Design has been working with organizations across Vermont to build capacity and better equip community leaders and legislators with the knowledge to equitably adapt to extreme weather with a specific focus on rural communities. So a big thank you to the core planning group here who helped pull both the first panel and this one together. And today you'll hear from both local and national experts on what this could look like for your community. And before we kick this off, just a few housekeeping measures. So just so you know, this event is going to be recorded, so you can revisit this information at any time. It's going to be posted on our Rebuild website, and it's also going to be sent out in a follow-up email. And we will have time for Q&A at the end as well. So any questions you have, please put in the Q&A box, and we'll be monitoring it throughout. And then at the end of this event, we'll share this information on the best way to sign up for upcoming future events. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Jake Hemrick, Community Planning and Policy Manager at the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development in the Community Planning and Revitalization Division. So Jake, I'll pass it to you to further introduce yourself and kick off the conversation with our experts.
Joey, thanks for the introduction. And as Joey mentioned, I work in the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development in the Community Planning and Revitalization Division, where we provide tools, training, grants, and incentives to support thriving and strong communities. I'm also a resident of a flood-impacted community, Berry City in Vermont, where I've served as both a city councilor, and mayor, and have also served as a planning commissioner for Berry City. So this is a topic that's really important, near and dear to my heart, and I'm thrilled that we have this great group of panelists. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in the order that they appear in the agenda. So I'll start with Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Pfeiffer. The state of Vermont National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator. I work at the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources.
Thanks, Rebecca. Kelly?
Sure. I'm Kelly Hamshaw. I am a senior lecturer in the Department of Community Development and Applied Economics at the University of Vermont and a researcher with the Center for Rural Studies. Been working a lot with manufactured housing communities, and we'll talk more about that shortly.
Thanks, Kelly. And last, we have Anna.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's great to be here with you all today. My name is Anna Weber. I am a policy analyst at the Natural Resources Defense Council based in the Washington, D.C. area. NRDC is an environmental advocacy organization, but my role specifically is to work on shifting federal policy so that we can reduce barriers to action to build resilient communities at the state and local level.
Well, thanks to all of you again for joining the panel today. And I'm excited to begin this presentation with just a great grounding in the National Flood Insurance Program from Rebecca. And I believe, Rebecca, you have a few slides that you're going to pull up for us. And I'll add, while Rebecca pulls up those slides, that if you have questions that pop up along the way, we do have a Q&A function. So you're more than welcome to pull up that Q&A button and begin entering questions, and we can pull those for later discussion.
And can you all see my slides now? My intro slide? Awesome. Okay. I have two monitors, and every time we use Teams all the time, whenever we switch to Zoom, I'm always like making sure I have my setup correct. So thanks, Jake. And for today, I'm going to try to cover some of the basic concepts. A lot of the agenda leaves time for conversation at the end. So if there's something that I go over really quickly, or something that I start to talk about, we can always follow up with it at the end. So just wanted to speak about some of the work that we're doing here in Vermont, trying to tackle flood and climate resilience. It's a big issue as part of why we're all here. But I think underlying all of this is the theme of community capacity, small rural communities and the capacity to do this really hard work. So thanks again for having me today. As I said, my name is Rebecca Pfeiffer. I'm at the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, and I head up our team of regional floodplain managers. Some of you may have worked with some of the folks on our staff, and we're primarily a liaison between FEMA and local communities. So, as I said before, I'm going to probably touch on some concepts and ideas that like a very light touch and move on because we don't have a ton of time. So we do have our flood training website where I encourage you to go look at some of the basic concepts if you want to learn more about any specific part of what I'm talking about today. So some basic floodplain management principles. I don't think that this is something that's a surprise or that I need to go into too much about this. But what I have here is from NOAA's climate.gov site, where we're looking at changes in precipitation. So the top two pictures of the United States on the right and the left show the change in precipitation, the increase in the northeastern United States in precipitation. And the difference between the two on the left is from 1901 to 2016. And on the right is a more recent snapshot in time. So as we look at our more recent past, we've seen greater increases in precipitation in the northeastern United States, but overall the trend is increasing. On the bottom are some of the different climate change models that look at the continued change in precipitation. So under lower emissions or higher emissions modeling, we see that, again, the northeastern United States is an area where we continue to expect increases in precipitation. So what we think of this is more rain or precipitation throughout the entire year, but also larger events, larger rain or snow events. And we also may start to see a change in how precipitation comes to Vermont specifically. We may have more times of drought with greater storms when the precipitation does come. When we talk about flooding in Vermont, it's important to think about the different types of flooding we experience. When we talk about floods, a lot of people think of inundation flooding, where the picture on the left shows this and where the water comes up and out. That's the Winooski River. The water comes up and out of the river and floods onto the big, broad, flat floodplains around that river. That's what a lot of people think of when they think of flooding. In Vermont, though, most of our flood damage is actually caused by river erosion. We have lots of steep mountains with narrow river valleys, and the water's moving too fast to spread out onto floodplains. There isn't a big broad floodplain because that water's moving so fast. So that water, you think about putting your finger over the end of the garden hose, and the water sprays really fast. You can use it like a power washer. That's kind of what happens to our rivers in a lot of our flood events. So it creates that power to do work, to erode. So we see road washouts. We see the rivers moving around across the valley. We may see houses picked up, lifted, and moved away. And so a lot of our flood damage comes from that river erosion, and that tends to happen up in higher, more mountainous areas where that inundation flooding happens at the lower valley bottoms where the valleys are broader and wider. And so when we tend to think of inundation flooding, I'm going to focus more on that in this conversation today, just because of the framing with the National Flood Insurance Program and flood insurance, but can speak about either. When we think about inundation flooding, we tend to think of our larger communities. And that makes sense to some extent. That's where the bigger, broader floodplains are. So there's more land available to create settlements. So a lot of our downtowns and more densely developed areas tend to be in these inundation floodplains. Those areas more susceptible to erosion tend to be the more narrow river valleys. So there's not as much land available for development in the future. So as we're thinking about challenges to rural communities and climate change challenges, I think we focus a lot on erosion in Vermont because it's where a lot of our damage occurs. But I think when we're thinking about housing and climate change, the thought about our downtowns is of how we look at flooding and flood risk there. We tend to think a little bit more towards inundation. And those inundation floodplains are really key features. So, if we're not if we don't have a town there, if we don't have our community there, these are really essential pieces for helping to maintain critical river stability. It's an area that slows the water down because that water can spread out and get stored in that floodplain, and all the things that are being carried in that floodwater also have the opportunity to kind of settle out onto that floodplain. So less debris is carried downstream to do damage to bridges, roads, and culverts and houses and development, and it slows that water down. It also helps to maintain and store sediment that would otherwise potentially be going downstream. When we think about flood insurance, when we think about how we think about flooding and floodplain management in the United States, it's usually through the lens of the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP. I'll probably use that as a shorthand throughout for the rest of the conversation. So the NFIP is a national framework for floodplain management. And I think this is a critical piece of understanding kind of where we're coming from. So this is a program started in the late 60s, early 70s, and it's kind of 4 different pieces to it. FEMA always calls it the three-legged stool. It's really 4 now. But basically, the key impetus to this is essentially flood insurance and insuring homes and floodplains. FEMA creates flood maps, and basically prior to the more recent past, the only way to get flood insurance on homes was through the National Flood Insurance Program. Most private insurance no longer provided flood insurance. It's separate from your homeowner's policy, and the cost is much greater. It's like earthquake or wildfire insurance. It's an add-on, an additional type of insurance. Most private flood insurers wouldn't provide it in the past. So this program was created. So FEMA created maps identifying where flood risks were, where the greatest flood risks were. Communities would voluntarily join the NFIP and basically make a commitment to enforcing regulations, a minimum set of FEMA regulations within their mapped flood hazard areas. Therefore, that allowed flood insurance to be available to anyone in the community. You don't have to be in the floodplain. You can be in or out of the floodplain. You can purchase flood insurance. Renters can purchase contents coverage. So anyone in a community that participates in the NFIP can purchase flood insurance. And then on the flip side of that, a benefit to the town for adopting and enforcing those floodplain regulations is that they are also then eligible for flood hazard mitigation grants. One of the challenges when we think about small rural communities, though, is that communities have to adopt, implement, and enforce flood hazard regulations. In Vermont, I say this in almost every meeting I'm in with folks from FEMA, is that about 90% of communities in Vermont have less than 5,000 people. So that just puts the context when we're talking about small. We're talking about very small towns. And I think the challenge is that a lot of our towns may not have zoning. And so when we're talking about a town adopting a flood hazard bylaw regulations, those are just like zoning, essentially. I mean, it's zoning in a floodplain. You're regulating the type of development that occurs in that area. And so they agree to adopt those standards, and then they have to have someone who enforces them, someone who issues permits. And our office really does quite a bit in trying to help with that technical review, but ultimately it's the town issuing the permits, the town who is reviewing the projects, the town who is interacting with the homeowner or landowner. And that's a big challenge. And I think the enforcement piece is always a challenge, no matter if it's a big or small community. A lot of the minimum standards that communities are agreeing to adopt and enforce are really focused on how to protect buildings that could be insured under the National Flood Insurance Policy to minimize the damage to those buildings. So basically minimize the potential for a claim under insurance. A lot of those minimum FEMA standards are focused on how do we elevate buildings above those flood heights. And it's not really a program concerned at impacts to other neighboring development, and it doesn't really look at the quality of those floodplains and the function of those floodplains. In Vermont, most communities are in the NFIP. About 92% of our communities are in, and you can see a lot of the communities that are not in the program tend to be in the Northeast Kingdom or along the spine of the Green Mountains in the Green Mountain National Forest. And those are towns that tend to be more challenged with implementing zoning, flood regulations in their town, or maybe that they don't have a lot of development in their floodplains. Our state role is really around, I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but it's really around municipal support. So a lot of what our state role is providing to towns is trying to help them to review development in floodplains, helping them with post-flood permitting, damage assessments, training, education, outreach. So a lot of our focus is on that municipal support, but it's still a really big lift. It's really a hard job for a lot of small rural communities to do and to implement. I'm not going to speak really too much about flood maps, except to say that FEMA makes flood maps. A lot of them in Vermont are very old. The bar graph on the bottom of the screen shows the average age of maps by county, and this was made about a year ago. So add an extra year onto all of those. So the average age of maps in Vermont are around 28 years old. We only have digital flood maps for about half the state. Those towns and counties that are in blue, the light blue, are towns that have digital flood maps. That's on FEMA's MSC, the Map Service Center, or on the Vermont A&R Atlas. So all those communities that are in green are towns that are using old paper flood maps that may be 40-something years old to administer flood regulations. So again, another challenge for our rural communities. This is FEMA's Map Service Center, where you can find your flood maps. Again, also our natural resource, or Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, the Natural Resources Atlas. We also have those maps, the digital maps up there. I'm going to speak a little bit about our Vermont approach. I talked about the minimum FEMA standards, really focusing on how to protect buildings and ensure buildings in floodplains. And we're really looking to move that policy to a different level and looking at a no adverse impact standard. Not to go into too much detail at this time, but basically looking at making sure any new development that goes in the floodplain is not going to create an adverse impact on development that may already be in that floodplain, and that we're not creating an adverse impact to your neighbors, to the river system, or to the person who may be putting development in a floodplain. And so part of the question is, what kind of development should go in a floodplain? Do we have housing? If we do, to what standard? Should we consider some things we no longer build in floodplains? So that's some of what I think as a state we're at a point where we're kind of almost evolving to the next phase of like what is appropriate development in a floodplain, is just elevating that adequate protection. So the state standard is really around not creating an adverse impact to people and development in floodplains, elevating any structures, new structures, or structures that need to be mitigated to 2 feet above the FEMA flood elevation. But is there a greater need for protection? Some of our post-flood considerations around post-flood towns as a minimum FEMA standard are required to issue permits for all repair work in a floodplain. Again, another challenge for towns as you're thinking about how do they implement flood standards on the front end, but after a flood, now you have all these homes that are flooded. They have to do damage assessments and issue permits for all the work going on in their FEMA map floodplain. It's a really big challenge. For some buildings, they also trigger the need to be mitigated post-flood. So that means that they may have to elevate their homes or look at other mitigation options. When we think about like the continuum of responsibility, kind of looking from one step to the other in terms of resilience, there's kind of the steps that individual homeowners can do, how to do home repair. So people who may have flood damage, but not significant damage, looking at how can they do repairs more flood resilient, looking at some of those bigger options, people who have to mitigate their homes, what options are available to them. There are some disaster mitigation grants available, but we're talking about like buying out homes. We're talking about structural elevations. We're actually lifting buildings up and looking at larger floodplain protection type program funding. And I think there's also that bigger community level. So ACCD, Agency of Commerce and Community Development, Jake Shop, worked with EPA after Irene to create a flood resilient checklist for Vermont communities. So thinking about where does our future development go? How do we avoid new growth in floodplain and hazard areas? And for those areas that are already in, of our town that are already in hazard areas, how do we better mitigate and adapt? Another way of a community that a community can look at kind of future mitigation is UVM, Kelly Hamshaw, who'll be speaking after me, and her team had created a risk assessment of all the manufactured home communities, flood risk assessment for the manufactured home communities in Vermont. So trying to get an understanding if we have some of our most vulnerable communities in floodplains or in river corridors, how do we mitigate that risk? How do we think about what the future of that community may look like? So these are some of the tools that are available. And then the last thing I just wanted to quickly touch on is some of the state legislation. This past legislative session, there was kind of two big pieces that impacted our program significantly. The first is Act 121, or also known as the Flood Safety Act. Part of it required us to look at the creation of a statewide river corridor regulation. So there's kind of two phases to that outreach and then going through rulemaking. And so we would be regulating at the state level development going in a river corridor. And again, I didn't speak too much about river corridors, but certainly can at a different time. The other part of this is for flood hazard areas under the Flood Safety Act, and that's creating a state minimum flood hazard standard for towns that are in the National Flood Insurance Program. So we talked a little bit about FEMA's minimum standards, but this would be the state of Vermont creating a higher standard that would be the baseline for all towns in the state to meet. And we would be starting with our no adverse impact rules, but again, looking at, is that still appropriate? Do we need to look at it, increasing that level of protection even greater, or consideration for different types of development, different areas of floodplains? And that also required us to participate and work out with a study committee on the state's role of administering the National Flood Insurance Program. I think, again, acknowledging and recognizing the capacity of small rural communities. So what would the state's role be in issuing and administrating the NFIP? The last piece I'm going to speak about, there we go, is the flood disclosure under Act 181. This was mainly focused on Act 250 reform, but in there was a piece on flood disclosure. I'm not going to go into too much detail on it, but just to say that there is now a statewide flood disclosure law in Vermont as a result of that legislation. And so some of these are some of the starting points, I think, for some of the conversation to come later in today's discussion. But how do these tools help us to build a more safe and resilient Vermont in the face of climate change? And with that, I will end my slideshow and turn it back to you, Jake.
Thanks, Rebecca, for that great overview and all the work that you've done over the past 2 years now. It's been quite a time of dramatic change, and I think a lot of the photos that you included in your slide deck just show some of the major challenges that communities are facing as they think about adapting. So appreciate the overview of the NFIP and some of the changes ahead. Before we pivot to the next presentation from Kelly, just wondering if you get a really common question, or if you have one or two recommendations for local leaders who are working in this space that they should be thinking about right now or working on right now.
I think some of that will be the discussion to come, but I really think, the challenge that we're faced with is that I think just thinking that housing doesn't have to come at the expense of flood hazards, and vice versa. And I think that's really one of the critical questions that we have right now. Is like, how do we talk about buying out houses and losing housing stock when on the other side of it, we have some of the greatest increases in homelessness in the country, and we don't have enough of homes to house people. And so how can those two things be true at the same time, and how do we move forward? And I think some of it will be just thinking about development in Vermont, and it may look different than it has in the past, and how do we resolve those two?
Well, it's a perfect pivot to move over to Kelly on, and she has some presentation about housing affordability and home protections.
I do. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Rebecca, for setting the stage there, and the shout out for the work that you've so generously, your team has supported for our team. I'm going to just be looking at I've got the Zoom arrangement of screens here, so just offering my slides on my other screen, but as we think about this this question that Rebecca kindly just kind of teed up here, as we think about flood hazards, resilience, and thinking about our communities, a lot of our work over the past 15 years has been focused on some of our most vulnerable communities in terms of affordable housing across our state. And so for our manufactured housing communities, who too often do lie in a flood hazard area, really trying to unpack what we've learned really since even before Tropical Storm Irene, and then again in 2023, and again, and unfortunately in 2024 particularly. So we'll just move right into this here. For folks who are not familiar with our MHCs or manufactured housing communities in Vermont, I normally do a much longer in-depth overview of what these communities are like. But for the sake of brevity today, just really want to emphasize that this housing stock is really an important source of our most naturally occurring affordable housing. So in terms of having a park owner own the land and operate the infrastructure, maintain that infrastructure, provide basic services to residents, who more often than not, over 90% of the homes in these communities across the state are actually owned by homeowners who live in them. So you have this unique situation where you have homeowners who are renting the lot and the infrastructure that supports their home within these communities. By the numbers, and a shout out to Arthur Hamlin, also part of Jake's shop at ACCD, the Department of Housing, just updated the annual mobile home park registry for the state. So we have 238 of these communities, really all across the state, from in every corner, with well over or about 7,000 lots, so it's about 7,000 households call these communities home. The vacancy rate, I have an asterisk, which is a nice segue into some of the key case we'll look at later on in this presentation, does include some vacant lots currently on the books in Berlin that were impacted by the 2023 flood events. So our vacancy rate is well under that 5% kind of benchmark that we use in terms of understanding what's a healthy rental market. And so certainly a 4.8 vacancy rate, and knowing that those lots particularly are questionable for whether they will come back online, to say the least. It really indicates that there is strong demand for these communities across the state. And the median lot rent was found to be around $413 a month, and that can include, really again a range of services in addition to simply renting the lot. So much more affordable than the average, 2-bedroom apartment. And certainly we'll look at some numbers specific to this community later on in this presentation, but just to give folks a brief kind of glance at the scene here in our state. We've been working on this topic really since the May 2011 flooding and Tropical Storm Irene back in 2011, to try to understand the unique vulnerabilities of these communities, including doing a statewide representative sample door-to-door survey, asking folks about their concerns, their experiences related to disaster resilience and flood impacts, thinking about who is living in the home, questions around health conditions, mobility challenges that would be a concern to folks in an emergent situation, especially if they had to evacuate. Back in that 2011 survey, about 40% of households reported that they would have a health concern or mobility challenges should they have to evacuate their homes. This map shows the Irene storm totals, the storm track, and then you can see the red dots represent the communities that reported direct impacts, and then the white dots show you communities, the remaining communities across the state. So you can kind of get a sense of how these communities are distributed across the state in general. With those flooding events, we had a number of questions that were raised. What resources are available for these communities, particularly in their response and their recovery efforts? How do we handle these homes that have been destroyed? They are still the property of the homeowner who's now just effectively lost their home, trying to figure out their next stable housing situation, and still, unfortunately, were at least initially thought to be responsible for removing those flooded homes. And that is still an important question, unfortunately, today. And then, do these communities actually face a greater risk to flooding compared to other types of housing in the state? And so this was an important focus of some initial GIS work that we had done, pulling mobile home park address. We actually had to put together the first digital map of all of these communities across the state. That enabled us to look at parcel data, pull E911 data, and then, as Rebecca mentioned, using the best available flood hazard data that we had at the time to try to put our wrap our kind of minds around, are we seeing something that is actually reflected in reality, or is this more something that just happened to be the word that folks were using a lot was a fluke event. And so when we looked at the percentage of housing type located in a flood hazard area using FEMA definitions, we found nearly 12% of manufactured homes located within park settings were indeed in a flood hazard area, a substantial difference compared to manufactured homes on privately owned land, and of course, single family homes coming in the lowest with 4%. And that was back in 2013, 2014 when we did that analysis. A lot has happened since then, but I will say having the opportunity to work with the Rivers program on their request to kind of revisit this question, to update our data and our understanding about the risk facing these communities, partnering with our spatial analysis lab colleagues at UVM and the CVOAO mobile home program, we were able to not only update some of our mapping, but then also be on the ground and engage community members in conversations through a series of workshops we did in some communities within central Vermont in May and June of 2023. Part of that GIS work really entailed looking both at FEMA flood hazard areas, and then also working with the river corridor data provided by the Rivers program, and some other types of hazards, looking at small stream strep packs and the dam inundation areas. I think we'll just call attention to looking at the number of communities with land within the FEMA mapped flood hazard areas. So we had about 66 of those 238 communities, about 27, nearly 28%. Of all of our communities falling in that category. And then when we look specifically at communities with home locations within those mapped areas, number is slightly smaller, down to 55, about 23%. That's still a substantial number. And when we think about the direct impacts to communities and potential losses for families and for the folks who are calling these communities home, I think what is helpful is that we know where these communities are, right? And we know that for risky types of events, that we can do outreach in these places and follow up when these events occur. Overall, when we put together the whole picture of looking at all of these types of hazards, again, these numbers get quite large quite quickly. And so I think what we're moving forward now is to kind of do more and expand more on the ground outreach with community members, with owners, and with other stakeholders in these communities. I wish I had more time to get into that, but we'll save that maybe a little bit more for the Q&A. I mentioned our ability to get on the ground and actually have conversations about these really challenging topics, quite frankly, with community members in the spring of 2023. We, in partnership with the mobile home program and their team of organizers, simply, had hosted a conversation, had some food and refreshments, brought maps, brought other resources for MHC residents directly to them, and set up, set up a pop-up tent and tables and chairs right within their park communities, and had a series of just discussion points and key questions. And these are some of the key findings that came out of those afternoons spent talking with residents. A lot of folks really focused on concern for their neighbors, thinking around particularly socioeconomic vulnerabilities, health concerns I mentioned earlier. We had a lot of folks talk about being concerned about older folks who lived alone, families with younger children, folks living on very fixed incomes who had, limited ability to leave their park should an event occur, or be able to rebuild their home if damage was sustained to their home. There was a lot of concerns about the quality and the ability for homes to withstand damages, for park infrastructure, should a water system be impacted, electric, all of those important things that make parks and their homes habitable, just simply beyond flooding, honestly. So a lot of concerns about aging infrastructure. A lot of our parks in the state were built 50s, 60s, early 70s. And so folks really thinking about those things already maybe not being in the best shape pre-event, and then what events could do to that infrastructure if flood should occur. Challenges with internal and external communication. A lot of folks really, thinking about how do you actually notify a group of neighbors really quickly? How do they, a lot of folks said, oh, I don't even know who my emergency management director is for our larger town or municipality. And so really thinking around how do we know if we're in harm's way and when an event is happening, and how to plug into that. A lot of questions around what has happened in these communities in the past. So folks thinking around a lot of folks who had moved into these communities after Tropical Storm Irene, asking us a lot of questions, quite frankly, about that history, and that being a concern. Additionally, thinking about affordable flood insurance and how to access. A lot of misnomers and misunderstandings about flood insurance and who had the ability to purchase it, and then for folks who even knew how to go about doing that, being able to afford that on fixed incomes being a definite challenge. And then certainly this question around flood risk education and hazard mitigation best practices for communities of homeowners who don't own the land upon which their home sits. A lot of questions around, well, what could we do as homeowners? And then how could we enter into conversations with our park owners about things that could be done to enhance the resilience of their communities pre-event, kind of being an open question mark. Rebecca already shared this slide, but just as an example of some of the maps that we created and are now hosted on the Flood Ready Vermont website, I think just really illustrates, and this quote from one of the meetings, this notion around we can look at the maps, we can look at this data, and we can understand there is risk. And yet, as humans, we really have a hard time kind of making sense of that when maybe we haven't experienced this yet in our daily lives. And maybe past events have happened in communities around you, but it hasn't impacted you directly. And that being almost giving you maybe a false sense of security. And that is something that we've heard come up multiple times in conversations with different residents going through this process. We were fine during Irene, we were fine during the May 2011 flooding, and this really took us by surprise. And so I think that is not an uncommon experience to go through. And so when we're thinking about, when we're sharing data that looks like this with community members, entering into those conversations really in an open and curious way is an important kind of mindset to bring. For one community that I've had a lot of experience with and knowing, working closely with residents through their recovery response and recovery processes was the Berlin Mobile Home Park, just right off Route 302, crossing the Wayside Diner here, and the neighboring River Run Manor. So about 40 households completely displaced from this community. And I think this is, the story is still unfolding in terms of folks who are still seeking their new normal, Many folks have moved on to more stable housing situations, while others are still trying to figure out what is their next best housing situation in a state that is in a terrible housing crisis. And so just to provide some context for what that actually means, for the majority of folks that we had talked with, many folks owned their home without a mortgage. And so some of their housing costs, base housing costs, their lot rent was $489 a month. When you compare that to the median gross rent for the town of Berlin, the most recent data that was available was in 2022, you're looking at over $1,200 a month for that median gross rent apartment. The median priced home that sold in 2023 was $335,000. For a family to afford that home, or a household to afford that home, they would have to earn well over $112,000 a year and have about $28,000 in cash on hand to be able to consider that a home that is affordable to them at the 30% benchmark. And so for me, when I look at this data, it really paints the story about really when you're thinking, if you've lost your home in a flood event, like we saw in 2023, and you want to remain in your community, it's a very steep challenge to take. And we've seen a lot of folks have to leave the town of Berlin. Really, a lot of folks wanting to stay within Washington County. Some folks have left the state, and unfortunately, some of our older residents in this community have had to move into assisted living with very few other affordable and small single-story options available for them. So the numbers are pretty stark, and then we're really kind of still tracking the recovery process here. Again, from conversations with residents, we've been hearing about just the complexity and the frustration, of course, of navigating all of these different aid programs. Thinking about the importance of supportive programs. So having case management specifically tailored for manufactured housing residents are a really key resource funded by Vermont Community Foundation with the CVOEO mobile home program. The state stepped in to help folks in the 2023 flooding, be able to remove their homes and help close the gap between their FEMA awards and their and the FEMA, like the $42,000 individual assistance limit to be able to help folks be able to move on with some philanthropic funds that became available. Still some questions around lot rent habitability issues within the park. Limited housing options was the #1 challenge that we kept hearing from folks. And then I'll just end with kind of thinking about not only have folks been through the trauma of losing their home and kind of figuring out everything from that initial impact and having to leave their homes and distress, coming back, finding their homes destroyed, and then trying to navigate all of the bureaucracy that comes with navigating all of the aid. But also this deep sense of losing their community connections with their neighbors that they had just been through this event with, and realizing that they won't be a community again together in the same way that they had been before. And then certainly at the community scale, looking at possibilities of closures, buyouts, and park sales. And so these are important things that we're still tracking, and we'll be continuing this work into 2025, not just looking backwards, but also getting into more proactive work with engaging some of our colleagues over in the civil environmental engineering program to really look at some of the communities that we've identified in that initial flood risk assessment to say what can be done, what are the particular what's the particular context for some of these individual communities, what is possible, and then how do we engage maybe in more proactive planning with households moving forward. So I think I'll leave it there. I'll hand it back to Jake, and then we can circle back to any questions that come up in the Q&A.
Thanks for that great overview, Kelly, and reminding us of the human aspect of this. This is about people's lives and their sense of community and place. With that, I'm going to pivot over to we're going to go to Anna Weber to talk about best practices for housing buyouts and improving communities out of harm's way. And I would just want to remind everybody attending, you're more than welcome to add questions to the Q&A. We're going to have plenty of time at the end to go through the questions and have the panelists speak the things that you want to hear about. So with that, Anna.
Great, thank you. Let's just go ahead and get a screen up. Let me know if you can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, perfect, thanks. Yeah, so thanks again, everyone, for coming to our webinar today. My section, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what happens when we can no longer do the things that Rebecca and Kelly described in order to safely stay in place and live in the same way in the same places that we have in the past. This is not a discussion that is specific to Vermont. And in fact, one of the points that I want to make is that this is a discussion that is happening all over the country. And I want to invite all of you to sort of join in this broader conversation of thinking about a better way to decide and act on how we want our communities to live in the future, and how we might use home buyouts as an opportunity and a tool and not just something that's a last resort. I do want to say before that I start, we are going to be talking about home buyouts and relocation. Obviously, this can be a really hard and emotional topic. And I do want to say upfront that I am not an advocate for home buyouts. I think the best buyout is one that never has to happen in the first place, and that we need to be working really hard to make sure that every community and family who wants to adapt in place has the ability to do so. However, in some cases, that's not the choice that folks want to make. And communities and families should be able to have all of the information and resources they need to make that decision. And if the decision is to relocate, then it's our responsibility to find a way to make that happen in the best way possible. So for those who aren't familiar with the concept of a home buyout, it looks pretty simple on paper. You have a home. Typically, we're talking about owner-occupied single-family homes when we talk about buyouts, but not all the time. I'm going to be talking about lots of different kinds of housing types. But there's some sort of housing structure that has been flooded maybe multiple times over a period of years. The resident decides that they want to move, and so they sell their home to the local town or city or county. Typically using federal grant money. The home is demolished, like in the middle picture here, and the land is restored so that it can provide those natural floodplain functions that we were talking about earlier. Meanwhile, the family gets to take the money from the sale and move elsewhere. That is the straightforward description of the way that it is supposed to work. Anyone who has ever had experience with a home buyout, or frankly, any kind of government grant assistance to do something with their home, probably is not surprised to know that in real life, it is intensely complicated. In fact, the typical amount of time that it takes to complete a federally funded buyout is over 5 years from the date of a disaster to the full closeout of this grant-funded program. And typically, your home is eligible for a buyout, that disaster isn't the first flood that you've experienced. And I have spoken with many buyout participants who have gone through flooding for decades, even before the opportunity to pursue a buyout is presented. I do want to especially note, since the theme that we keep coming back to here centers around community capacity, is it takes an immense amount of capacity to even just sort of go through all of these steps. It takes capacity on behalf of the municipality, it takes capacity on behalf of the state, it takes capacity on behalf of the individual homeowner and their community. Even in cases where community members have decided that they want a buyout, that this is the option that they want to move, that doesn't always mean that the money is available. It doesn't mean that there are safer homes to move to. It doesn't mean that even if there are safer homes to move to, that you can move into them with the money that a government grant is willing to pay or on a time frame that actually makes sense for your lives. Buyouts are really tricky because they sort of sit at this intersection of disasters and housing. Both of those really, really complicated systems. Both of them have a lot of inequalities and inefficiencies and inequities built in. And so they sort of sit at the intersection of those as almost a multiplying factor for complexity and inequality and demands on capacity. Basically, they're not only compounding in existing problems in a community, but they can create new problems and basically take what might be the worst experience of someone's life, a flood disaster, and just adding another disaster on top. But this one, a disaster of bureaucracy and stress and uncertainty. However, at the same time, we're facing a situation where the fact of the matter is that more people want or need to move, and this number is just increasing. So the current processes and programs that we have for home buyouts, frankly, can't even deal with the current need and demand, let alone scaling up to larger scopes and overcoming the barriers associated with more complex situations, like, for example, a manufactured housing community, which is not what these grants were originally designed to accommodate. And in many cases, the folks who are facing the prospect of relocation are the same folks whose homes are, even if you do own it outright and can get a good payout, are not going to carry the amount of value needed to secure new housing. This is obviously true in a lot of places, especially true in Vermont and other states that are facing such intense housing crises. I do want to come back again to this point that even in cases where communities have decided that buyouts are, the approach that they want to pursue, it's never anyone's first choice. And again, the best buyout is one that we can work to prevent. But in cases where we are faced with the necessity or desire to pursue home buyouts, we're trying to determine ways to make them better and use them as a tool to move forward to create a more resilient community instead of something that is just the last and sort of least bad out of many bad options. So that brings us to some recommendations that I want to bring to you all in a sort of invitation to join a conversation. Here at the Natural Resources Defense Council, I've been convening a series of conversations about home buyouts over the past few years to try and combat one of the things that is a huge barrier in terms of not just improving home buyouts, but making more resilient communities in the first place, especially in situations where relocation is involved. If you think about it, in a situation where community is pursuing home buyouts, everyone in that community probably, if you're a homeowner going through the process, if you're a local floodplain manager, buildings department manager, whoever the practitioner is, who's trying to implement the project, you are going to become an absolute expert in all of the processes and programs and forms and paperwork and everything that you need to do. But at the end of that process, if you're a homeowner, by definition, you will have left the community. You've taken your buyout and moved away. And of course, local staff come and go as well. And so what we see is actually a huge kind of brain drain and lack of applying lessons and innovations in the context of buyouts. And that's what this project is designed to address. Our goal is to bring together people who have lived experience with home buyouts, as well as people who have professional experience, to capture those lessons so that they don't leave the conversation and provide recommendations for localities and states and federal agencies alike, as well as individuals and their communities. So I just wanted to share a few of the top recommendations that have come out of these conversation series. A lot of these actually are very similar to what we were just hearing about in the case of resiliency in manufactured housing communities, because a lot of them aren't really about buyouts. They're about these sort of bigger picture steps that a community can take to build its resilience in the face of flooding. A lot of the conversations that we've had with both practitioners and community members come down to this idea that you can't just have some money parachute into a community, buy out some properties and call it a day. You have to find a way for these projects to be incorporated into a larger vision for what the community is going towards in a sort of climate changed future. And this requires advanced planning. This requires finding ways to identify funding. This requires a lot of partnerships. All of these things obviously require capacity, and it's often capacity that small towns and rural communities don't have. But it's critical for us to be thinking about ways that we can identify solutions to be building this capacity. We have very similar recommendations from community members who have gone through buyouts or advocating for buyouts on behalf of themselves and their neighbors. Again, a lot of similar themes here about having access to information, having agency and decision-making power, understanding what all the steps in the process are, and seeing how this project fits in to an overall plan for how risk is going to be reduced for everyone in the future. In fact, the top recommendation that we hear over and over again from people who have gone through a buyout, gotten the money, and moved is that, sure, they want future buyouts to be better for people who have to go through them, but they would prefer to see a future where people don't have to go through buyouts at all. And this links in a lot of ways back to what we heard at the top of this webinar about planning for flood-safe development and thinking about how to invest in housing so that we're not creating problems for the future. Finally, if anyone's interested, we can talk a little bit about the policy shifts that need to happen here. Obviously, a lot of this does come down to increasing investment in state and local capacity. Planning ahead, thinking about proactive rather than reactive approaches. We can't just wait for the next disaster to come so that we get some disaster aid flowing into our community and then try to put it to work. We need to be ready before that happens. Some of these are shifts that we frankly need to see at the federal level, changes to programs like the National Flood Insurance Program, changes to the grant programs that tend to fund buyouts. But some of these are things that we can be doing at a state or even a local or community level so that we are ready to have these conversations when they arise. In other words, the sorts of values that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about how to build a better buyout are the same concepts that we're thinking about overall when it comes to climate resilience and adaptation. What's the experience of the people who are experiencing the flooding and deciding what to do about it? How can we build a bigger picture program that isn't just based on individual sort of whack-a-mole style projects? And at the end of the day, what is our community moving towards, not just geographically, if people are moving, say, up the hillside out of the valley, but in a bigger picture sense, what are we moving towards in the sense of how do we want our community to look? Where and how do we want to live? How can we design our lives so that everyone can thrive in the face of these changing conditions? I do just want to take a minute to make a quick plug if you want to learn any additional information about the project that I was talking about bringing practitioners and communities together. Feel free to grab these links here, and we can also share them at the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. So I'm going to invite all of our panelists to come back on screen and unmute. We have, just as a time check, it's 12:58, and we are ending the webinar around 1:30. I thought we'd start off with just a little bit of a group discussion with the panelists, and then I'll start pulling some questions from the Q&A. One thing I wanted to start with was just about flood insurance and myth busting. What do you think are some of the top misunderstandings about flood insurance?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is that I hear is I can't get flood insurance. Like I can't get flood insurance because I'm in the floodplain. I can't get flood insurance because I'm not in the floodplain. I think that that's one of the biggest things, and also that homeowners insurance covers flooding, which it almost never does. Like I mentioned, it's typically, flood insurance is an extra add-on. The triggers for flood insurance to purchase it, it's usually at a sale. We now have flood disclosure in Vermont just recently, but it's like that connection between the risk and the need for flood insurance isn't always there. And so trying to have people more aware of it. And there's like the trigger for when it's required, when you're required to have flood insurance is when you're in that FEMA mapped flood zone. But there's also places where you may it's still a good idea to consider flood insurance. There is more information at FEMA's website, floodsmart.gov. It's a great place to go to learn more. And I don't know, and I'm sure you probably have thoughts too, and Kelly, from the conversations that you've had with different groups of people.
I mean, I can just quickly say, I guess not so much on the myth side of things, but really just the harsh reality that a lot of folks they would get quotes for flood insurance and they wouldn't be able to simply make the math work. And so making really difficult choices for folks who knew that they wanted to consider purchasing home flood insurance, but then just simply not being able to afford to. We've also, heard of situations where folks who maybe had some flooding damage during Irene or another FEMA declared event, not continuing to carry flood insurance, and that certainly put them in a really terrible position with not being eligible to receive additional aid from another event. And that, certainly when you're thinking about folks who are in some of our areas that have had either like repetitive flooding, even if it's not like take out your whole home at once, that leaves them in a really even more vulnerable position. So I think a lot of questions around that, a lot of a lot of support, and then just the economics of it for individual families is just challenging.
So thinking about those places where there are repeat flood events, how are you thinking about moving communities out of harm's way, especially where there may be significant infrastructure, a lot of existing investments, and how do we increase the resilience of those communities?
I guess from what we've seen play out, the reality, I think Anna really underscored it in her presentation, is that nothing that deals with, this is essentially like managed retreat from climate change. And so none of it is quick and easy. All of it's really hard. And a lot of it is focused around like, how do we re-envision our communities? Like Anna had in her presentation, like moving towards something, not just away from the river or the floodplain, but moving towards another vision. And that's really hard. I think in Vermont, planning is done at the individual town level. There's regional plans, but we don't really have a state plan. And I'm sure, Jake, you could probably talk to this in the role that you're in, and trying to create some cohesiveness amongst that. I think, when you're talking about in the question and answer, I see that there's question about manufactured housing communities, like how do we move them? Because you're talking not just about individual lots, how do we move them affordably? How do we create the infrastructure around them? And so I think it really takes a lot of a larger planning effort, kind of very intentional planning effort of what do we want to, like, how do we want affordable housing to look in Vermont? Because there is a disproportionate number of people in manufactured housing communities who are in floodplains.
I think actually this question of manufactured housing communities provides like a really interesting example of how we can move, and we'll have to move, from one by one, property by property movement or relocation towards a more cohesive whole community plan. Because in the case of a manufactured housing community, because of the way that ownership works, you have to have a whole community plan in order to do anything at all. Whereas in the traditional case of a home buyout, for the past 40 years, we've been able to sort of just do them piecemeal, where it's like very, very focused on individual owner-occupied residential properties. And that's hard enough, but it is deeply insufficient, right? It's hard enough to just buy out a house and move the people. Frankly, the programs that we have right now mostly just focus on buying out the house, and they don't really care about the people. Not that the people running the program don't care about the people, but the funding mechanisms are very, very focused on just reimbursing you for what your property is worth and not providing you what you need in order to move forwards. But we're going to need to do better, because buying out individual houses is not managed retreat. It is maybe a tool, however, that we can use towards managed retreat. And we're probably going to have to use buyouts as a sort of existing tool or framework in order to move towards managed retreat, because basically it's the tool that we have. But I think the question, and this is the question that I try to address in my work, is how do we do that? How do we move from property by property buyouts towards, let's call it managed retreat, or just more resilient communities? I mean, how do we move from, town by town planning into something that works for a larger region or a whole state, or a watershed, for example? And I think these are like really, really, really hard questions, but they're questions that we're going to have to grapple with, because, the alternative in many cases to managed retreat is not going to be the status quo. The alternative is going to be unmanaged retreat. And that's like possibly the only thing that's worse.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think, to your point, Anna, it's like house by house is not a really effective tool. And we're dealing with that in several communities, especially when we're outside of mapped floodplains. So in a lot of those smaller, narrow river valleys where like the town is spending more money to maintain a road than the value of all the homes on those roads. We have, several communities who are really grappling with, do we rebuild this road? And the millions upon millions of dollars it would cost to do so for 8, 10 homes. Like, what is that tipping point? At which point we say, we're not going to rebuild the road, or what are our alternatives? What are the alternatives? And how do you get an entire neighborhood on board with that concept? But it's kind of like, it's not easy. It's not easy. And it's a big conversation. It's going to look different for every community as well, too. I mean, I think that's really the big story, is that we see that across the board, is every community is going to have a different approach. And, some of it's going to be capacity, some of it's going to be willingness. There was a question in the Q&A as well about the impact to the grand list. Jake shared that you're from Barry City. I know that that's something they're struggling with. A lot of the very large communities, you're looking at many, dozens of homes that are looking for buyouts. And how does a town balance that loss of grand list value versus the risk? And I would be remiss if I didn't say, Chris Campany, the director of the Wyndham Regional Commission, says it all the time, of what is also the cost of not buying out the home. So there's the private, risk to private landowners and homeowners, but there's also like, what if they walk away from the home, and then the home is now abandoned and vacant? And what does that do to the property values of those surrounding homes too? So there's also impacts to not buying out that we don't, I think, fully grasp at this point. So.
Kelly, were you gonna jump
I was
in?
gonna just pipe in to say, in response to Pat's question in the Q&A around how do we make our parks more resilient. I think one of the things that I keep trying to bring up in conversation is, let's invest in our communities that are not in harm's way. So as those communities are looking for, maybe there's a private park transitioning ownership, let's put resources behind maybe the residents in that park if they want to proceed with co-op ownership in those less risky places, and preserve the housing that are not currently within those flood hazard areas. I think right now we have the rapid refill program that the state is supporting to put new homes that are more energy efficient into either new lots or existing open lots to try to help increase maybe in small numbers and by community, but larger numbers over the next year or so. And giving priority to folks who were impacted by the 2023 and 2024 flooding events is an important, like, immediate step that can happen. And I think there are a lot of people that just say, like, oh yeah, if we had a magic wand, we would just build from the ground up, right? In a safe place with the best, possible infrastructure from the ground up, using, what we know now and bring in new homes. But until we can get to that point and find that mythical piece of land, perhaps, and the right partners to have around the table, I think really investing and preserving the less risky places for manufactured housing residents is the right next best thing we can do.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, a lot of the conversation around like big picture managed retreat or like climate mobility, whatever the buzzword is that we're using for it right now, when we talk about like the concept of a receiving community, we often think about it sort of just like at a cultural level. Like, we're like, okay, well, one day everyone on the Gulf Coast is going to wake up and move to Duluth, right? Like, there are places that are like climate havens or receiving communities. And frankly, a lot of people in the past, and still, I think of Vermont as one of those places. And it's been a real wake-up call for other parts of the country, I think, to look at places like Vermont, to look at places like Asheville, North Carolina, and say, oh, wait, these places that we thought would be safe are no longer like the safe havens that we thought they would be, at least not in their current state. And I think this speaks to the need to invest in safer places, like Kelly is talking about, so that they can meet their own needs and thrive, right? Because that's the only way that you can take in folks from elsewhere, right? Is if you have more than what you need at a baseline, and also to sort of rethink how we're thinking about receiving communities, because the fact of the matter is, in the vast majority of cases, people who take a buyout or people who relocate on their own because of a disaster or because of increasing hazards, they're not packing up and like moving sight unseen across the country. They're moving to the other side of town. They're moving to the next county. They're moving, right over the state line because their kids live there and they want to be closer to their grandkids, right? And so a lot of this has to do with thinking about investing within our own communities. What are the relatively safer areas in our communities that exist now that we can invest in, so that we can be our own receiving communities for people who are going to need to, say, move out of the floodplain within a given place.
Yeah, I
mean, so there are two questions I think related to that thread where people are looking for specific examples, models, best practices for that community level flood resilience planning, whether it's planning for buyouts and new homes. And then also wanted to build on that to a question related to what the state's doing to do more coordination related to broader scale land use planning and river corridor regulations. So are there any best practices, buyout, new models, local planning models for that supporting residential development for resilience?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can speak a little bit to what the current state of that is, and I don't know if that's best practice necessarily. I mean, I think a lot of ways to speak to, I think the idea of like, what is our future vision? A lot of times mitigation and hazard planning happens in FEMA, like in the world of FEMA and local hazard mitigation plans. And it's not necessarily happening in like the town municipal plan or the county or regional. I mean, it's there a little bit, but it's not what drives it. I mean, we've seen this in communities in Vermont. I'm sure it happens all over the place where like the town sets up their growth center, like specific to Vermont language, like they set up a growth center and they push it forward, and then like the entire thing's in the floodplain or the river corridor or both. And so it's kind of like, is this the best place for us to be directing our growth? And that's like where the infrastructure is going to be built and extended to. That's where all of the kind of development incentives are going to be pushed to. Yeah, I think I saw Pat in one of her questions in the chat say, like, does the state have to pay for all these things like expansion of wastewater, sewer, and everything for roads? Is there ways that we can incentivize development? I mean, I think that that's where we're at right now, is like, what are the tools that can bring private investment, you know, to the table with public folks? And I think part of it is a robust planning process, but it's easy to say that, it's hard to do it. Like FEMA gives communities through the state money to do the local hazard mitigation plan, but it's a small amount of money. Regional planning commissions often aren't able to competitively apply for that money, but they're the ones who are typically working with the towns on municipal plans and regional plans, and probably have a really good handle on that bigger picture and vision. And Jake, you may also have experience being in the Agency of Commerce and Community Development in the planning group there too. So it's easy to say this is where we're going to. It's hard to then align and incentivize that planning and the partnerships to happen. And I think that's where like those best case scenarios are, like I don't have any off the top of my head. And I guess, part of what I see from Vermont a lot of times is like, well, we maybe have to create something, what makes sense for our scale, because, Vermont as a state is about the size of a county of a Western state. And so that economy of scale is a real thing here. 90% of towns have 5,000 people or less. So every small town, like we really, I think as Vermonters, value our independence and small town community conversations, but it's also something that I think we're reaching that maximum capacity. The legislature has a study committee, and you may know more about this, Jake, of looking at the role of county government, because we essentially have no county government. What is the role of county or regional government to help tackle some of these much bigger pictures, like watershed-wide planning? And I think the state is a piece of that, but there's the question about how are we coordinating all these different levels of planning, and it's like as best as we can. So we talked to Jake and Chris and folks at ACCD. They talked to us. We talked to Stephanie Smith and at the Vermont Emergency Management about local hazard mitigation plans as best we can. We're all really busy and try to talk, but I think that probably the umbrella of climate change and climate resilience is kind of maybe the way that we're all together moving forward. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. That was a lot. So other people may want to jump in.
Yeah, well, although I'm not a member of the panelists, it's my impression that we're definitely in a period of rapid change. Not only the climatic events we're seeing, but how our government's responding to them. Act 181 was a major overhaul of our land use framework. It will develop more consistent regional plans across the state, which can be a platform for more coordinated investment, and hopefully investments that are more affordable over the long term. And at the same time, the statewide regulation of river corridors and flood hazard areas, as Rebecca pointed out, is shifting. I don't know how to answer the question though from Jonathan, if Vermont is ahead of the curve compared to other states or other mountainous states, or not. But maybe Anna, who has more national perspective, might be able to speak to where Vermont is compared to other states.
I'm going to give the cop-out answer, which is that I don't think it's fair to compare states to each other, because everywhere has its own circumstances, and everywhere is moving, at their own pace. One thing I will say is that there are a lot of opportunities to be learning from other parts of the country. The challenges that Vermont and other Northeastern states are starting to grapple with now are questions that other parts of the country have been dealing with in real time for a long time now. There are communities in the Gulf Coast, for example, who have had to entirely relocate because the land where they were living doesn't exist anymore. And it can be challenging to like make those connections, especially at the community level, to sort of learn the lessons from other places. But I think that's going to be vital, regardless of, you know, who you are or where you are. We have to sort of stop reinventing the wheel when it comes to these questions of how do we plan for the future? How do we build more resilient infrastructure? And continue to build on what other places are doing.
Thank you.
One thing I will, I guess, just speak to a little bit. I did not speak a lot about river corridors at all, just in the interest of time in the conversation. But that is a major player and point in how we look at flood hazards and ongoing climate resilience, because it is such a large driver of our flood damages in the state. So again, that adjustment of the stream from erosion and the way that we look at and manage the areas in and around rivers. So it's not just about building higher. If the river moves, it doesn't matter how high you are above the stream. If the river moves and your house is gone, your house is gone. And so a lot of what we do is really through that lens of river corridor protections. There was a question in the chat. I'm like, I could talk for hours about river corridors and river corridor protection. I kind of very high level touched on it as one of the things that we're also doing, is developing that statewide standard around river corridors. And really the only way is of avoiding damages in a river corridors, avoiding development, new development closer to the river, new development in those river corridor areas. And so I think, you know, one of the things in our state rule, our flood hazard area river corridor rule, the FARC rule, it's very small jurisdiction that applies, but it's basically an expansion of that would expand the river corridor standards. And if we integrate a statewide floodplain, you know, standard for development of some sort, we are very different. I'm just going to say, like, we are very different from a lot of the other programs across the country, because that is a very big focus. We're the only state that has it as a statewide regulatory layer and have it mapped and have such a large jurisdiction at this point with that. And that expansion, we're the first state that would have any sort of statewide standard. And also how we work with our towns on flood hazard area development in our state, because we have a consult, a technical assistance consult with towns. I think that we're trying to, like, I think Anna said it, the best buyout is one that doesn't have to happen because there's nothing there to buy out. And that's how we look at it with permits. The best permit you issue in a floodplain is the permit you don't issue because you got someone to move it or change it. And so I think one of the things I keep trying to advocate for to FEMA and federal programs is to incentivize that better planning on the front end. So instead of having states doing lots and lots of training, which is important, the role or support of having better permitting and standards is really how you avoid having to kind of like dig yourself deeper. And so we really focus on that from a state program. That is our top priority, is trying to look at how do we better develop projects that avoid impacts in floodplains and degradation of those benefits that help all of us.
I think a lot of the same can be said for building codes too. Like at a structural level, this is not like the sexiest topic. Like, people who are like, I want to fight climate change. Okay, great. Let's talk about building codes. Like, that's typically not how that conversation goes. But that sort of like underlying framework of something like building codes or something like permitting rules really guides like how and where we live fundamentally. And those are the big questions that we're grappling with. And so I think I am definitely seeing like more and more consideration of things like building codes and floodplain management standards, like you're talking about, Rebecca, as ways to make sure that as we continue to develop, because we need more housing and more infrastructure, we do it in a way that's not going to be like kicking the can down the line and creating problems for our future communities.
Yeah, one of the questions in the chat from Scott was about the role of residential building codes. And I think it's an option. I know that there has been some focus. We don't have a statewide single family residential building code in Vermont. And so that only kicks in public buildings, multi-units, and it's really focused on fire safety. There is no flood aspect to our building code in the state. And so I think building codes are one way to do that versus local zoning. But I see them as both having the same issue, which is the capacity to effectively implement them. So we can do it through building code, but we need to have, that means that we need to have the inspectors and the building officials to enforce that building code. It's the same issue on the zoning side. If we do it through zoning, which is how we currently do it, through regulations, through rural regulations and zoning, you need to have people who can review, analyze, like issue permits and enforce it. And so whether it's through zoning, which is more tied to planning typically versus the building code, I probably, not surprisingly, prefer the zoning approach because it's a more holistic look at how you're using the land in and around rivers versus the building code, which is how do we build a building that's safe and can withstand flooding. So you could do both. I mean, I think that there's benefit to both. You have a zoning code that's going to look more at like what is the appropriate land use in and around rivers, and do we build buildings here? And then if the answer is yes, we build a building here, how is that building built? You know, because the strongest house that's built with like wind resistant roofs and all the different engineering for foundations to withstand hurricanes and lake ice and everything like that, it doesn't matter if the river erodes and washes the foundation away. So it could be the best built house, but if the river is moving and it takes half the house with it, you know, it doesn't really matter. And so I think both of them are a piece of it.
Yeah, or if your house stays safe but turns into an island for days at a time and you're completely cut off from your community, from stores and emergency services, and the fire department can't get to you because your house is surrounded by floodwaters, you know, we have to be taking a bigger picture approach to just this property by property.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Rebecca, a little bit of your presentation talked about the new legislation that would move more jurisdiction to a statewide scale, and we had one question about the timeline for some of that rulemaking, and where they can find more information about it.
I think we actually don't have a website page about the new Act 121 language. And I think the high level deadlines for the river corridor rule, I'm just bringing up my slides here. We're kind of tasked with outreach and education 2025 to 2027. And then the rulemaking would have a new permit effective in 2028. You know, and at the time of when the act was passed in the legislature, when it passed into law, and at that time, and especially now, we had already said we would probably be, as an agency, going back to ask for an elongated timeline, and then we had another flood on July 10th again. And so I think that's the big thing, is like the caveat is always like, this is the timeline as long as we don't continue to have flooding, because the staff who's responding to the flooding and supporting towns and recovery is also the staff who's working on the rulemaking and working on the other things. So right now in statute, the rulemaking would have a new permit going live in 2028, but we would likely, I think, as an agency, be asking for an extension to that timeline. I think in testimony this last session, I think we were asking for like a 2030 rule for statewide river corridors. I'm not sure what the agency would be asking for in this new session, but and so that's for river corridors. For the flood hazard areas, just the state minimum flood hazard standard. So again, like FEMA has their minimum, which is how to build a building safely in a floodplain, so they'll insure it. A statewide minimum flood standard would be, you know, we're looking to initiate rulemaking in this next year, with a rule going into effect for towns to adopt. I'm assuming there would be some sort of transition phase of like, here's the rule and towns need to adopt this by this year.
Well, we've talked a lot about the longer term community scale planning to get ahead of problems. But there's lots of questions about really the response recovery in the chat too, related to mold remediation and some of the near term things people can do after a recent flooding event. maybe let's start with the one about if a property that could create flood mitigation does not cooperate, what remedies are possible there?
I saw Annette put that, yeah, repeated that in there. At this point, I mean, as a state, I think that we still move forward under the assumption that everything is voluntary. Buyouts are voluntary, home elevations are voluntary. I do not speak for anyone except for myself, but I would imagine we would continue under that same understanding that it's a voluntary thing for a private individual to voluntarily agree to join into a project. It has killed projects in the past. In my community, this was like before all of the flooding that we recently had. Our regional planning commission was trying to do a floodplain restoration. I mean, this is like over a decade ago, and you had one landowner who didn't want to give access, and the whole floodplain restoration fell apart for 5, 6, 7 other owners. So it does happen. I know that there's been some in the news where they've talked about it. One of the tools that the Army Corps of Engineers has used in the past, and I'm not advocating for this at all, but it is eminent domain. I mean, as a state, we've consciously said we would not sign on to using Army Corps funding because of the requirement that we would have to promise to use eminent domain. Eminent domain is basically saying we're going to make this project happen for the greater benefit of the public good, at the expense of this individual private owner. You're compensated for your loss financially, but we're going to kind of move forward anyway. And I don't see that as being a tool in our toolbox of eminent domain. Unless someone else wants to correct me on this, but I think it's really trying to get that buy-in from that landowner of the benefits and the options of subdivision of portions of land to try to move forward with a project, or having to rethink the scope, or looking for other alternatives.
Are there great resources that you would point local officials to that have, for examples of how people have successfully responded to flooding?
I was going to look to Anna, because Anna, you may have federal, like national, not federal, but national type of places or thoughts. I mean, I think at the state level, we'll share our slides. And in my slides, I use a lot of QR codes because they're quick and easy to get a web address. We do have a flood training website. It's floodtraining.vermont, all spelled out, .gov. We also have our flood ready website. And tomorrow there's another meeting about state websites and how we communicate flood resilience and stuff. So I think it's an ongoing thing that we're looking at developing. We're looking at trying to develop small modules, training modules. The Association of State Floodplain Managers is a group, a nonprofit group that I know that has some trainings available, that some of them behind paywalls. Anna, I don't know if you have other like national kind of resources that you would want to share that NRDC, is part of or aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much out there, but it's one of these things where you often don't know what it is until you already know what it is, which makes it hard to find. In addition to the Association of State Floodplain Managers, who have really good resources, I would also recommend folks take a look at the materials that the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado has. They have a ton of webinars that are recorded, and they're all free on their website. And they feature a lot of case studies of innovative things that are happening in communities all around the country. Another resource, actually, and I say actually because we might be surprised about this, is FEMA's website has gotten a lot better in the recent years. It's still not the easiest thing to navigate, but the hazard mitigation staff at FEMA headquarters and in their regions have been putting a lot more attention into documenting case studies, and particularly for communities who may be interested in pursuing FEMA funding, can be really instructive to look at some of the case studies of projects that have been completed with FEMA funding, so you can get a sense of like what the possibilities are. In my conversations with the staff who run these grant programs at FEMA and other federal agencies, they often say that, like, yes, bring us innovative ideas. We want to approve new and exciting and innovative projects, but it's hard to know what that is. Just like from your own community's perspective on the ground. So like seeking out case studies of other places, I think, is a great way to go about it.
Well, thanks for those great resources.
I was just going to
I
pipe
see
in,
that
Jake,
we're at-
quick if I could,
Oh,
just
yeah.
to say that we're working partly with support from the DEC Reverse program and then our partners at the CBO Mobile Home Program, specifically to tailor outreach materials for manufactured housing community residents because of their unique situation. A lot of the handouts and resources that have been, broadly distributed really don't meet their needs in terms of how quickly you need to respond and deal with things like mold I saw mentioned in the chat. Given the type of the way that those homes are constructed. And then some of the other important considerations about not being on foundations and being on pads and some of the elevation and tie downs and those sorts of things. So we're working on developing some very tailored outreach materials around that, and then having that available through the state's website, at the CBO Mobile Home Program website, directly for residents and park owners as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you again. I'm gonna pivot over to back to Joey to share some next steps.
As we come to a close, thank you everybody for joining this conversation on flood insurance and housing. And a big thank you to all of our panelists, Rebecca, Kelly, and Anna, for sharing your time and wisdom with us, and Jake for moderating as well. You did a great job. And also thank you again for our planning team too, VNRC, VPIRG, VCRD, who are really like the backbone for pulling this series together. I want to share a little bit about the upcoming session. So our next session is called Regional Planning and Leveraging Nature as Climate Infrastructure. And this is going to happen in late January. So we would love for you all to join us again. I will share all of this information and the links for that in the follow-up email. And then finally, I will also be sharing a 2-minute post-session survey right now in the chat and also in the follow-up email. So please let us know if you have any feedback on the topics and also what you guys are interested in learning more about next time. So I just put that in the chat, and thank you everybody again for coming. See you next time.